So, good morning. And I have to apologize also for the lack of a coffee break. It'll be 30 minutes, and then I think you get your break. I've really been so touched and moved by the reception I've received here from Reverend Darrell, from David Johnson, from all the people I've had the pleasure of meeting with since I arrived yesterday. And just want to say my connection a little bit to Methodism, because I know there are a lot of Methodists here. My children attended a preschool that's housed in the largest Methodist church in the world in Evanston, Illinois. And my synagogue meets in a Methodist church in Lakeview in Chicago. And later on this year, I'll be teaching a class at Garrett Theological College at Northwestern University in Evanston with some other wonderful people, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim liberation theology. It's really a new course, and we're still figuring out how to put all those pieces together. So I'm here today on behalf of Jewish Voice for Peace to perhaps shed some light on some Jewish perspectives, and I've listened to the presentations, and there's so much that I just want to say amen to myself. Pretty much all of what Gary Berg said just changed the proof text, and it's what I believe. The good stuff is shared, and I want to get back to that later. So, like Elias Abuna Shakur, I too was not born into any religion. I too started out as a baby. But Judaism kicked in pretty soon after that. I was born in England, in Manchester, into a very Orthodox community, a lot of Holocaust survivors and refugees. It seemed that anybody above a certain age seemed to have a European accent. And then when I was 11, my family moved to Israel. I discovered suddenly that we were Zionists. I did not know that before. And we moved to Israel, and I grew up in Israel for 20 years, junior high, high school, 3 years in the military. I was a settler on the West Bank. I was part of the settler messianic ideology. And then I gradually moved away from that, and that led to my leaving Israel in 1998 and establishing my home here. And I'm married with my family here, and I'm an American now. So I'm really happy to be here, and it's just a pleasure to share these conversations. And one thought that came to mind as I was having all these conversations was what the Jewish peace activist Chuck Mannequin says. He's an Orthodox Jew who's very progressive on Israel-Palestine. And this quip, which I think translates into many religions, is, I cannot talk to the people I pray with, and I cannot pray with the people I talk to. Anybody had that experience? Some amens. Okay, so it's like family and friends, and I'm happy to have this conversation with you. One of the things I was so impressed about the conference was how you opened up the floor to both Christian Zionists and those who oppose Christian Zionism. That you're really stretching yourself to be part, to have the bigger conversation. And that resonated with me because it's a point of pride for me that I'm the first pro-BDS rabbi. BDS, everyone knows what BDS is, right? The first pro-BDS rabbi to be hired by a Jewish synagogue as a pro-BDS rabbi. This was 2 years ago. So there are many of my colleagues in Jewish Voice for Peace who, like me, sort of came to sort of more stronger sort of Palestinian solidarity after having established themselves professionally, in their relationship with the congregation. They could sort of take that on as well, allow themselves to take that on, the congregation could take that on. But to come in cold, I'm really the first, but there are others who've since joined synagogues. And I think that speaks to a sign of hope, of that things are shifting. There is an openness. And all the shrill sort of anti-BDS shunning and criminalization, which I felt, I'm sure you've experienced or know of others who have, there is also a shift that's going on at the same time. In a way, naming it and criminalizing it is the first step towards getting beyond it, right? In South Africa, when apartheid was just what you did, there was nothing tangible to attack and take down. When they passed laws legislating apartheid, then there was something concrete that you could go after. So in a way, this dark time is necessary, I believe, to get to that switch. So now we know what it is, we can say, we're not that, we're something else, because it's been named, we can name something else. So in my synagogue, there are Zionists and there are non-Zionists. And to make this work, I had to commit to being okay with the Zionists, which was a concession on my part, right? Because I know I'm right and they're wrong, right? So we all know that, right? We're right, you're wrong, right? But to sort of be in community with them, I had to sort of find a way to be with them in communion as fellow Jews without that tripping them or me. And I had to ask them a bigger ask to be okay with their rabbi being something which is completely wrong, being an anti-Zionist. So that's something that we're still working through. And it's a work in progress, and it's a commitment. And I'm committing to this in principle, because I don't want my Judaism to be reduced to anti-Zionism, right? I heard how some people say that Christianity has been reduced to Zionism. Somebody at the back was telling me previously, just earlier, how you can reject you can reject the Nicene Creed, but you can't reject Zionism and still be a good Christian. Well, we have the same thing in Judaism. You can reject pretty much all of Judaism, but you cannot reject Zionism. So that's not my Judaism, right? My Judaism is much richer than that. At the same time, I distance myself from some of my fellow rabbis and activists in that I don't want my Judaism to be about anti-Zionism or just to be solely about pro-Palestinian solidarity. I want to get to a Judaism which lives comfortably with that, but is bigger than that. And you know what? I don't have to look far to get to that. And this was the subject of my rabbinic thesis, because the idea of a restoration of Jews to Palestine as a political plan is only 120 years old, right? The idea that the Bible, the Old Testament, what we call the Hebrew Bible, is what motivates Jews and has for 2,000 years is completely false. It's completely false. We have the Talmud. Professor Daniel Boyarin, who's a radical Talmud professor in California, has this great quip. He says, "We would have called the Talmud the New Testament if the name hadn't already been taken by you." So a lot of the work that the New Testament does in recontextualizing the Old Testament is done at a parallel by the rabbis of the Mishnah and the Talmud, right? I mean, as we know, for the first few centuries, Jews and Christians were in shared communities, and a lot of the conversations were similar. An eye for an eye, decentralizing the land. I wrote down a bunch of the New Testament quotes that Gary Berg shared, which sound very familiar to me. God is moving us from Pentecost Acts 2. I don't think I'll be preaching New Testament to Christians. This is cool. God is moving his people away from Judea, not into Judea. God is not limited to any one land, but appears in any land, from Acts 6. And so on. It's the idea of decentralizing land. But for Jews, it wasn't about finding the fulfillment of that covenant in Jesus, because as Jews, that's the polemic. That is the definition of a Jew, is not to accept Jesus, right? And that's the polemic between Jews and Christians. That's why this conversation is perhaps more complicated than any other interfaith conversation, because we are so close, we're so different, like siblings, right? So for Jews, for rabbinic Judaism, it wasn't about finding the fulfillment of that covenant in something else, but it was about breaking the covenant. In a way, there's almost a reversal here, contrary to perhaps the received wisdom that we Jews are the continuation of the ancient Israelites, and Christians kind of broke off. In some ways, there's a reversal here that Jews are the ones who broke off, right? Jews said, we're done with the land, right? So if you go to the very early sources of rabbinic Judaism, I'm putting on my rabbinic seminary professor hat now, so excuse me, but I know that you did text yesterday, so the Mishnah, right, the 2nd century earliest work of rabbinic Judaism, which encompasses all of Jewish knowledge and law, has 2 or 3 of its 6 sections focused on laws pertaining solely to the land of Israel and the temple worship. Right? So the very first section, the opening section of the entire body of rabbinic Judaism, is devoted entirely to laws pertaining to the sacredness of the land of Israel. So to do with the sabbatical year, the Jubilee year, tithing, grain, laws that apply only to farmers in Judea and the Galilee, not to Jews in Babylon or further afield. Later on, the last two sections of the Mishnah deal with the laws of sacrifices, animal sacrifices in the temple, ritual purity, and so on, which were no longer valid in the 2nd century, a century or more after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And yet it was included in the body of rabbinic Judaism in the aftermath of that time. But fast forward a few centuries to the Talmud, the second part of the Mishnah, the Talmud, and there, all of a sudden, there is no commentary on those sections. So if you open up the Talmud and you see that first order, the first sixth of the day, there's nothing. It was written in Babylon, outside of Judea. They said, we're done with this. In a sense, seeing it in the Mishnah and then seeing the empty page afterwards is the teaching that we're done with this. Right? We still keep that as sacred text, but we've moved beyond that. Our focus is on the next section, which is the section of Jewish holidays. And that establishes the Jewish consciousness, which still lives strong to this day. If you ask any Jew what's central to Jewish practice, it's Shabbat, right? It's Passover. It's the holidays, right? That is the second section of the Talmud, not the first. We skip over the first in a rejection of the land and turning to sacredness in time versus sacredness in place. Anytime that this was challenged throughout Jewish history, and it wasn't challenged much, right? Anytime somebody tried to say, you know what, let's get back to the land. Let's do it. Let's do it now. Let's fulfill the messianic vision of Isaiah and so on and build the third temple, right? You know what those people eventually were called? False messiahs, every single time. And we've had dozens and dozens of them through Jewish history. Somebody said, let's bring that end-of-time vision into politics and into history, into the real here and now. Let's do it now, and I'm it. It always smashed. It always ended in failure and in utter rejection. So it's been tested over and over again. So when Zionists tell you that Jews have always been in Israel, and it was only like finally in May 1948 that we finally managed to make it happen, it's just not true. It's false, right? How many Jewish settlements in Palestine were there in 2,000 years? Count them on the fingers of one hand. Rabbi Yehuda, HaChassid, beginning of the 19th century, a few hundred families. There was never a mass movement of Jews to move to Palestine. In 2,000 years, they couldn't rustle up anything? Really? I mean, when people just passed through, you know, the most eminent Jewish thinkers, Maimonides, and so in the medieval times, they went on pilgrimages. They didn't go to stay. They didn't dream of bringing in hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, nothing like Zionism, which emerged only in the 19th century. That wasn't their program. In fact, that again was the Judaism that's lived to this day. When American Jews think about Israel, it's to have the bar mitzvah at the Western Wall. That is called a pilgrimage. It's not, nobody wants to move there, with very few exceptions. My family was one of them. But people, that's not what it means to be Jewish, to move to the land of Israel. In fact, Zionism is a repudiation of Judaism. Don't take that from me. Take that from the rabbis, the leading rabbis at the end of the 19th century, who responded to the emergence of secular Jewish nationalism, Zionism. So, in any stream of Judaism, you know, there are many ideologies in Judaism. So whether you go to the Orthodox, who are the devout traditionalists, the Reform, more assimilationist, liberal, secular, that they all spoke out forcefully and poured out, you know, much ink in denouncing Zionism as not the Judaism that they know, and they'll be doomed to failure, each in their own way, each according to their own ideology. Just like today, the one thing that unites pretty much all Jews is Zionism, then the one thing that united all Jews was anti-Zionism. The founder of American Judaism was Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, founder of Reform Judaism in the 19th century. He came on the scene before there was a Zionism, and Zionism only became a question at the end of his life. He was active throughout the middle part of the 19th century to the end of the 19th century. And he, when Zionism came on the stage, he said, this isn't the Judaism that I dreamed of. America is my Zion. My Judaism is here. I'm not waiting to move to any other country. including Palestine, including Judea. So I grew up in a non-Zionist community, although it was on the fringes. My elder siblings were going for a year in Israel and so on, so it was like I could hear the Zionism, but the education system I was part of, the Jewish education system I was part of, did not promote Zionism. That came later. So for me, my personal path away from Zionism was easier because I already had that in my history. I was fortunate enough to be at the tail end of pre-Zionism. And that is the bulk of Jewish history. And that's what I'm aiming to go with my synagogue and my community, is to reestablish Judaism that is not obsessed with Zionism on either side. Now, to get away from it, you have to step into it, right? It's almost like for me to have successful interfaith, I have to talk about this. But it's not the end of the conversation or the entire conversation. It's the prerequisite for everything else. So for instance, I co-founded a Jewish-Muslim group in Chicago with the Mosque Foundation in Bridgeview. And I was invited to be on the first interfaith panel of the mass ICNA gathering. It's the largest gathering of Muslims in America, 12,000 people, 15,000 people. They meet over Christmas at the McCormick Convention Center. I guess you get cheap rates over Christmas. So the Muslims come to Chicago. It's a plot. And all the other interfaith speakers at this conference were religious leaders who have interfaith on their business cards. So the Archdiocese of Chicago Ecumenical Vicar, people, this is what they do, right? I was the only one there who doesn't do this for a living. And the organizer, the Muslim organizer of this interfaith panel, said that she had been holding out for somebody outside the mainstream Jewish community because she wanted to get to a conversation which includes Palestine. So as you all know, if you don't know, I'll tell you now, there's one rule about interfaith dialogue, which is no Palestine, right? And we are all about upsetting that, right? Not because we have to talk about Palestine, but if that's what our Muslim and Christian interlocutors want to talk about, who are we to say, to deny their experience, right? So have an amen for that? Oh, thank you, all right. So they get to talk about what they care about, and they can't be bludgeoned into saying, you've got to shut up about what you care about in order to have a conversation with me. That's just not cool, right? So, and the same attitude I go with regard to the Jewish community. In my synagogue and beyond, I affirm the range of opinion on Israel and Palestine. The range of opinion includes anti-Zionism. The range of opinion includes Zionism. That is just a fact. To be a pastor to a congregation, to be a rabbi, is just to say this is what is. This is what lives in people's hearts. How do we make that work? And this came to a head this past summer in Chicago. I'm sort of going through a lot of different things, and I'm sorry I'm going a little fast. I got 30 minutes to do everything, so thank you for bearing with me. There'll be coffee soon. Every 2 years, there's a grand gathering of the Jewish community in Chicago called the Chicago Jewish Folk Arts Festival. Chicago Jewish Folk Arts Festival. It's really the only place and time when the entire Jewish community in Chicago, 250,000 people, thought, get together. So it's really interesting to discover what are the red lines, what are the boundaries of who's in and who's out. So for reasons I'm not going to go into today, there is one rule in the bylaws, which is that there's no professing of Christianity, and I'm happy to unpack that with you at another time. But this year, they added one more rule, and that is anybody who supports BDS. But anybody who supports BDS cannot present at the Chicago Jewish Folk Festival. In other words, I cannot present there. A rabbi in the community is not welcome. And tens of thousands of others. Who is included? Well, the Jewish Defense League had a booth there. Jewish Defense League, or according to the Southern Law Poverty Center, is a hate group. Their member, Baruch Goldstein, Dr. Baruch Goldstein, was responsible for the massacre in the Ibrahimi Mosque in 1994, which the JDL, Jewish Defense League, endorsed after the fact. So if they were not Jewish, they would be called terrorists. They're included. So to me, that was a horrifying, every time I think that we've hit rock bottom, we go down another floor. It feels like America sometimes. You think you're done, and it's like, that too? The reality of that thugs, violent thugs, are honored in my community, and peace activists are shunned. I mean, that's shocking, and that is the reality. And it's just part of my job is just sort of to wake people up to that. And I think that is the sort of the good news part of my talk, which is that I think that the extreme times we're in with regard to Israel is actually a cause for hope and an opening. And I certainly used it in that way. I've been struggling for a while how to talk about Israel in my community without triggering the Zionists, that they could actually hear it. And this past High Holidays, a month ago, I think I finally hit on it because I felt very good about what I said, and I was told it was received well. And that was talking about equality under the law. The nation-state law, you know what that is? Right. Nation-state law was a gift in a way in terms of the discourse here. I mean, it was terrible, as we heard from Abuna and others. But in terms of shifting the way we can reach other people, reach Jews, I think it's been a gift because the conversation in the Jewish community, at least, has always been about the West Bank. Christ at the checkpoint. That's in the West Bank. That's not in pre-48, right? The occupation. That's been the focus of the conversation. And liberal Zionists promoted that by saying everything that happened until June 1967 is basically okay. Let's talk about what happened in the Six-Day War and the occupation of the West Bank. So it's been really hard to talk about 1948. The nation-state law puts that on the table and gives us the way to talk about that, about the basic inequality and the basic racism in the Zionist program, which has nothing to do with the Six-Day War. It's inherent from the very beginning. So that's given me and I think others the framing of talking about equality under the law. In December I'm speaking at the Rotary Club in Milwaukee. They had the Israeli ambassador to the US, Ron Dermer, speak there in the summer, and they've invited me to offer the rebuttal. And I'm told that a lot of people there are not progressives, they're sort of Republican, sort of business leaders, and I'm going to use that framing of equality under the law. In Judaism, it's called Torah Achat, one law. It resonates with Americans, and I think it reaches Jews in ways that the other conversations already are too toxic to get to. How much time have I got now? 5, wow. Okay, so now I'm going to press you a little bit, okay? So when I came here, I went around at meals and I made some friends and asked what do you want to hear and what you're interested in. And I did the same before I came here. I checked it with my friends and JVP and beyond, like what should I convey when I'm up here in the time that I have. And this is what I heard. If you want to reach Jews, the name Christ at the checkpoint is problematic, okay? That's not me. I actually argued with a friend about this because I didn't feel it, and I'm still not sure I feel it, but I'm just conveying to you on behalf of others. This is a Jewish scholar who's really out there on all the right points on Israel-Palestine. I know the intention was good, and I get the intention, but if you're approaching Jews, the idea, if Christ is at the checkpoint and Christ at the Palestinians, what does that make the Israeli soldiers, right, with 2,000 years of the problematic relationship between Jews and Christians? Christian anti-Semitism is real, and this will trigger Jews. It won't work. So you need to think about that. The other thing about, to really hammer home is that to examine, when you talk about Jews and quote the Bible, that's not what Judaism is. As I said at the beginning, Judaism is the Talmud. Lots of Jews don't know that either, actually. I struggle with this. But Jews are not the Bible. The book of Joshua, right, was edited out of the rabbinic canon. We read, every year, the Jews read the entire Torah, which is the first 5 books of the 24 books of the Old Testament. That's on the scroll in the synagogue. We started 2 weeks ago, after the High Holidays. From Genesis, we read every single portion, every single line. And then when we get at the High Holidays to the end of Deuteronomy, we roll the Torah back to the beginning. We never get beyond the 5th book to the 6th book of Joshua. We live in the wilderness. We live before the land. And when we get to the end and we're about to enter the land, Joshua, we go back to God created the world for everyone, the universal message of Genesis. That is an editing that the rabbis introduced. They hold up the Bible saying, this is the world as it is. Genocide, war, conquest. This is the world in the synagogue that we want you to meditate on and educate your children and cultivate. So it's by having Joshua and then turning away from it, we make that message that we're not about the land and the conquest of the land. Interestingly, the Zionists love Joshua. Ben-Gurion used to have a study group on the book of Joshua because that's the mandate for going in and doing whatever needs to be done. So read the Talmud, because the Talmud is all about what I just said, and that's the Judaism that I'm rooted in, and that's what gives me the spiritual framing to be who I am, not a Zionist. The other thing, which is, I'm sure you heard about replacement theology and supersessionism. I was tasked by Archbishop Theodosius. He's the senior Palestinian cleric in the Greek Orthodox Church, which is the dominant Palestinian church, from what I'm told, to translate the Kairos document from English into Hebrew. I did that. I did what he asked. Visited him in Jerusalem. I happened to visit him on Theodosius Day, so I got this Theodosius cookie, which is only cooked on that day. I love that kind of stuff. But he tasked me with that, and I got to work. I have 2 young children, so it took me a long time. And by the time I was done, somebody else had done it, and that's the one that's published. However, I had the spiritual practice of sitting with that document, and I feel very comfortable with Kairos Palestine. In the mainstream Jewish community, it's rejected as anti-Semitic because it uses language from the medieval disputations between Jews and Christians in medieval Europe. I argue against, particularly supersessionism, right? That Christians have now taken the place of the Jews. It doesn't bug me. Religion is the domain of saying I'm right, you're wrong, dealing with absolutes. As long as we live and let live, it's fine. But I'm letting you know that for many Jews, that is a button. That is a button. And you'll hear things like, Hitler tried to kill us with gas chambers, you're trying to kill us with love. I mean, you'll hear sort of that kind of hyperbole, but people feel that. And that's why I wanted to get in another point, which is, the other day, I was watching a debate, Bill Maher had a debate about whether the feelings of white men in America about feeling wronged, because of the Kavanaugh hearings, whether that's fabricated or authentic. Whether it's a rehearsal of outrage and victimhood, it's so hard to be a white man in America today, really, or is it real? Because it feels real too. And I look to my children to understand that. You ever have a child have a meltdown? And then somehow you manage to talk to them, and you sense that there's a meta-child above this child screwed on the ground who's operating that child to get that piece of cake on the counter, right? But the distress is real. Those tears are real. The pumping heart is real. The sweat is real, right? So I'd say you can have both. You can manipulate emotion and feel the emotion, right? Does that ring true? Right? You can have both. So you can sort of set yourself up to feel like a victim when you're the regional superpower or you're a white man in America, and then you can really feel it. You can feel it because the cultural ground is shifting under your feet and so on. So it's true that Zionism is geared to make Israelis and Jews feel like victims. It's a manipulation. It's also true that they really feel it. Now, how are you going to deal with that? Right? If you just tell them you're manipulators, try that with your kids. Right? It doesn't work, because we're dealing in the world of emotions, not in the world of facts. Well, I have more, but I'm out of time. I just want to end with, I see this as the beginning of a conversation. You're welcome to reach out to me. The easier email is my email, rabbi@makomshalom.com. Makom is M-A-K-O-M, shalom, S-H-A-L-O-M. And I'm happy to continue the conversation and do more of this. I feel a lot of hope in being able to have the conversation with people I don't pray with, because there's a lot of richness there, and I think that gives me hope and allows me to go back to my community and do more. So thank you for all that you do.